I'm Jim Tullio. I've been producing records since, I would say, 1972. I started recording actually before that, but I started actually being a producer in 1972. I'm 71 years old, so I was really young when I started. And I've been doing it ever since. I never had another job in my whole life. And I raised a family of two daughters. Now I have four grandkids, all through music. So I'm one of the lucky ones. I never had to have a straight job. You know what I mean? So anyway, you're listening to Talking Blues.
Wow. Not a straight job at all.
Never.
That's amazing.
It is amazing.
So, if I understand this correctly, you come from a musical family. Your dad was a jazz musician.
The jazz drum.
Tell me about what impact that would have had on you being who you are today.
I mean, it was monumental. He's my biggest influence, my biggest hero. I mean, he died in 2003, but when I was four, my brother's 3 years older. So he started my brother on the drums when he was four. So when I was four, he put me on his lap and he taught me how to play a blues progression on the piano. So that was and I learned it, so I got to understand blues, very very early. And then I took up the guitar, and I wasn't, it was pretty good. Um, and it was during the era of, it was before the Beatles, so it was pretty much mostly rock and roll. I did learn a little bit of jazz on the guitar, but by the time I was 14, the Beatles had come out. I think when I was 11 or 12, and my brother and I bought every single Beatles record the day it came out, and learned every song because we had a band. We had a four-piece band. And then by 14, my father brought home an upright bass. It was a really, really cheap, not very good bass. It was spray painted black, and he brought me that and a fake book, and he said, "Here, learn this." And you know what a fake book is, don't you?
No, I don't.
A fake book is a book of standards. There's like 300 or so standards.
Okay.
Just the heads and the chord changes. Because my father would do a lot of weekend gigs. He would do weddings, whatever, and he said, I want you to learn so you can come and play with me on the weekends. I couldn't do the night gigs because he played strip clubs and bars. I was too young to go to those places. But he would, once I learned how to play, and I had a head start because I knew how to play guitar. So I really had to learn the fingering of the bass. I knew the notes from the guitar, but you have to learn the positioning and fingering and all that. And I learned that pretty quick, and pretty soon I was playing gigs with my father, you know. And during that same era, um, I was still a huge Beatles fan, and when the album Revolver came out, if you know that record, I'm sure you do.
Mm.
That's what got me interested in music production because that record, all of a sudden, our four-piece band couldn't play those songs because there was so much production, especially Tomorrow Never Knows, that song. So that's what really got me interested. So my dad had bought us, even before that, he bought us a sound on sound tape recorder where you can record on the left side and then overdub on the right. So you can play a piano part and then sing, or play a guitar part and then play a piano part, whatever. So I had a little bit of experience doing that, not a ton. And then soon after Revolver, I'm trying to think of how many years. It wasn't that long after that they came out with four track, and TIAC came out with a four-track cassette. I think that was the first thing, and then they came out with a four-track reel to reel, probably by '67 or '68, and I bought both of those. So I started learning how to to ping pong tracks and do all that. And a lot of times, if I filled up the four tracks after ping ponging them, I do a mix of them to a two track, and then I bring that two track back to the four track, and I have two open tracks. So that's how I learned sort of how to do all that in music production. Um, I mean, believe me, I didn't just learn how to do music production by doing that. It was a long process.
Musically, you were into the Beatles. You obviously your dad probably would have exposed you to a lot of jazz.
Hmm.
When did writing music happen?
That came early. I think I wrote my first song when I was 10, but it was terrible. Um, but I had the interest in it. I had the interest in writing and making my own music. And but like when I heard the Beatles and then heard Dylan, because I'm a big Dylan fan and I loved him. I think I heard Dylan before the Beatles came out. I did. Um, and I just thought to myself, man, will I ever be that good? Can I ever write a song as good as John Lennon or Paul McCartney or Bob Dylan? Um, and for a long time, I thought no. And I kind of still feel that way, but I don't know if I'll ever write a song as good as Bob Dylan or John Lennon. But anyway, that's what got me into writing. Here's a funny story. I went to Catholic school. So, and now this is before the Beatles. This is maybe 63, um, beginning of 64 in that era. Um, we had nuns. And if every time you did something wrong in the class, one of the girls in the back room would put a check mark against your name. And at the end of the day, however many check marks you had to write 1,000-word composition. So normally I'd have at least one or two, if not three, every day. So I had to go home and write these. So what I would do is I'd copy Bob Dylan songs because they had 7 verses. And she had never heard of Bob Dylan. This nun, she thought I was crazy. I'm copying songs like "The Death of Haiti Carroll" or I mean, talking New York blues and all that sort of stuff. And she thought I was absolutely out of my mind. But that's kind of a funny thing.
When did you think? I mean, did you ever doubt you would pursue your dream of being a producer,
No,
being in music?
no. My father told me when I was 15, I was already doing the weekend gigs with him. He says, "So this is what you really want to do, right?" I said, "Oh yeah." I never had a doubt. He said, "Well, he says, know this." He said, "Only do it because you love it, and don't have anything to fall back on because it's too fucking hard." His exact words. Because he says, if you have something to fall back on, you're going to fall back on it. Most people do because it's too difficult. And he also used to say to me, "Look, you're never going to be great until you know what great is," which I thought was a very profound thing at 15 to say that to me. So he gave me a lot of great advice, and I followed that advice. You
I wonder how he viewed himself as a musician. Would you know?
Well, he was always a little insecure because he couldn't read, and he did some recording, not a lot, but he was a feel guy. He had incredible feel. He just had the best vibe on the drums, and he was steady as could be. But he just had feel. I learned a lot of that from him. And as a player, I always had feel. I wasn't the best upright player. I didn't have all the chops, but I had feel, and I played the right notes. So for a long time after that, I was an upright bass player. I played with a lot of different artists, some really big artists.
Can you elaborate on the idea of feel? Is that something one can learn? Is that something that's in you? I mean, if your dad had it, is it given to you, or is it something that if you didn't have it, you could learn it?
I don't think you can learn it. I don't know. I just would sit and watch my dad, and then when I finally got to play with him, that's what gave me that. I mean, but I probably had something before that. I mean, I think the feel thing. I really think you're born with. I mean, look at the great drummers. You know, Jeff Porcaro, Vinnie Caliuta. What's the guy from New York? 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. What's his name?
Steve Gadd.
Steve Gadd, John Robinson, Peter Erskine. I mean, these guys. It's a natural thing. They didn't learn that. Speaking of Peter Erskine, I grew up with Peter Erskine, and he and my brother's older, but he and my brother used to take the bus into Atlantic City. We lived offshore. Atlantic City's an island, so we lived right across the bay from the island. So they would take the bus. Peter and my brother would take the bus into Atlantic City to get drum lessons from a guy named Johnny Severa, and and my brother was really good, but I think Peter was just exceptional. He started playing with Stan Kenton when he was 10. So he had the feel. I mean, he didn't learn that. How do you learn that? You know? I mean, composition is the same way, in my opinion. You can learn structure of a song, but the inspiration is, in my opinion, it's metaphysical. You know what I mean? You
Mm-hmm.
can't learn to be great. You have to understand what great is, but you can't really learn how to be great, or write a great song.
So I'm thinking that if your goal was to one day become a producer, I think it's probably not necessary, but pretty important that you understand music. So being a player helps you be a better producer.
Well, let me get into that a little bit. I went to a Catholic high school, and they had 2 years of music theory. So by my junior year, the public school near me had a 4 year program, which was really unusual. So I left the Catholic high school and went to the public school so I can get junior and senior year music theory 3 and 4. And in music theory 3, we got into Walter Piston's book Harmony. I don't know if you're familiar with that book. And then in
No.
senior year, we got into Walter Piston's book Orchestration. So I was learning how to orchestrate senior year in high school. And then, believe it or not, I'm not dropping names here, but when I was 18, I got to study with Aaron Copland for about a little less than a year, about 11 months.
How did that happen? How does that come
Well,
to be?
I was in a band called Harvest in New York, and we were in the recording studio, and we had a cellist in the band, and he had to leave the session one day to do a concert with that. I think I'm not sure if it was at the studio or at a rehearsal, something. And he had to leave to go do a chamber concert with Aaron Copland. So I said, "I'm going with you." You know? And it was close to where we were living at the time in New York, and there wasn't a lot of people there. It was just a chamber orchestra concert. There might have been 50 to 75 people there. So afterwards, they had a little reception, and you could meet Copeland. So I did, and I was brazen enough to say, "Hey, do you take students?" And he said yes. And he lived about 25 miles from where I was living west. He lived in Peekskill, New York. So I went out there, and he took me. I mean, but it was funny. I was living with a band at the time. We were living all in the same house. This was 1972. I think it was 70. But anyway, none of us had much money. And I had to pay $75 a lesson. So I never had food money. But I couldn't tell my bandmates that I was doing that because I would have to scrounge food off of them. And if they knew I was spending $75 on a music lesson, they would have killed me. So I had to sort of keep it a secret that I was doing that.
Can I ask what you were hoping to get out of those lessons? Like, what interested you in doing this?
Well, I wanted to learn from him more the art of composition rather than orchestration, even though I sort of knew about orchestration and I could do that, but not as well as him. But what he drilled into my head Oh, by the way, everything I wrote, he completely ripped apart. It was very humiliating. You know? He completely tore it apart, and for good reason. It wasn't very good, you know. But what he did teach me, he said, the problem with modern music is that most composers, no matter what genre they're in, they write harmony first. In other words, if you're writing a song, you get a set of chords, and then you sing a melody on top of that. He said that's really not the best way to do it because you're building a fence for you, and your melody can only go so many places because you're restricting your melody. You know, he said write melody first, and always make sure the melody can stand on its own without the aid of harmony, and you're going to write stronger melodies. And he just kept drilling that into me, and we worked on that for pretty much the whole time. And he was also very, very big on variation, like taking a melody and being able to harmonize it many different ways and being able to do many different rhythmic treatments to it. And that really helped me. And I don't know if you know this, but I did jingles for 20 years, from 1980 to 2000. And that really helped me in that world. Because in the jingle world, when you're a music producer or composer for hire, you got to do whatever they ask you to do. On Tuesday, I might be doing a polka. On Wednesday, I might be doing an orchestral score. On Thursday, I might be doing a reggae track. You know, on Friday, I might be doing a swing jazz thing. Who knows? So I had to know how to do everything. And what Copeland had really drilled into me really helped in that area.
I mean, obviously you knew who he was and what he had accomplished, but working with him, did you appreciate how great an artist he
Oh
was?
yeah, I mean, I was a huge fan. You know, I started listening to Aaron Copland when I was like 12 or something. You know, 12 or 13. I mean, he just knocked me out. I thought he was. I still think he's the greatest American composer.
So musically, you were all over the place.
Yeah,
You had the jazz influence, you had your Beatles, you had your classical music.
yeah.
Um, I don't know what Harvest played, but
I was like a folk rock band, but then when that fell apart, I joined a guy who was like a Django Reinhardt guitar player kind of thing. So we had a little swing trio. So it was really into swing, that old, hot club of France sort of stuff with Django and Grappelli. And then after that, I really got more into the blues. I was in a couple pretty heavy blues bands, nothing famous at that point. Um, and that's when I started producing, around 71, maybe.
okay. So at that point, when you finally get the opportunity to do so, do you quickly realize, yeah, this is the dream realized?
No, because I was just starting, and I wasn't very
Okay,
good at first. You know, I mean, I was again. It was all the artists I was working with were they were guinea pigs, and I did everything for free because I was trying to learn.
right.
You know, that's how you have to start. You got to do shit for free. You got to find people and say, hey, look, can I record you? Can I produce this? You know, and I did that for quite a long time. In '76 or no 70 yeah '75, I moved to Chicago, and I moved to Chicago because, believe it or not, I got a job writing music for Playboy magazine. Hefner had put millions of dollars into laser technology, along with the Philips Corporation, and they came out with this thing called a laser disc. I don't know if you're old enough to remember those.
I
Yeah.
am.
And so his idea was to make video magazines for the Laserdisc. So they hired me to score the music to it because I had submitted. My brother-in-law at the time knew someone that worked there, and we were living on the East Coast, and they were in Chicago. So I submitted a tape, and the guy called me up and said, "Hey, we'd like to hire you." So my daughter was a year old. I was married. My daughter's now 50, so it was a long time ago. My older daughter. And so I went out there, but the job only lasted about 8 months because nobody bought those things. Because if you remember, the disc itself was $50, the
Hmm.
player was 5,000. So in '75, who had that kind of money? So it died a quick death. So I stayed because I knew a guy named Steve Goodman. I don't know if you know who Steve was.
I do.
So I met Steve in the early '70s because he had leukemia, and he used to drive in to New York from Chicago to get his blood transfusions and his chemo treatments because he wanted to go to Sloan Kettering, which was the best cancer hospital in the country. And back then, Chicago didn't have as good of a hospital as that. So he would drive twice a month. And I'd be playing, sometimes I'd be playing with David Bromberg or playing bass or whoever. And usually I used to see Steve because after he had his treatments, he'd come into the village and just sit in with everybody, you know. So he would always ask me if I was around. He'd say, Tullio, play some bass with me. And I got to know Steve pretty well. So when I moved here, he's like the only guy I knew in Chicago. So when that gig ended, he hired me to play bass with him.
How good of a bass player were you?
I played upright. I didn't play electric back then. Um, I wouldn't say it was fantastic, but I could groove my ass off, and I played the right notes. I had really good time, and I played the right notes. I didn't have the dexterity like Stanley Clark or some of these guys. I couldn't do any of that shit. But it didn't call for that. But I played in tune, and I could groove, and I played the right notes. So,
When I look at your discography, the first few listings have you as a stand-up bass player,
right,
if I'm not mistaken.
right.
Was that your main instrument of choice, or is that just what you were being hired for?
When I became a working musician, that was my main instrument. I also played guitar. Um, and a little bit of piano. I can't say I'm a piano player. I can play a little bit. But bass was my main instrument as a working musician.
Okay, so at this point, when you start dabbling in production and becoming a producer, can you tell me at that point what you saw the role of a producer was and maybe how that's changed over the years?
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, the role of a producer, you know who I learned a lot from? Did you ever hear of a guy named Joel Dorn?
No.
He was out of New York City. He produced Roberta Flack. He did Killing Me Softly, the first time ever I saw
Mm-hmm.
your face. He produced Asleep at the Wheel. He produced Aretha. He produced so many artists, you know. And here was a guy, he was deaf in his left ear and knew nothing about music technically, but he was a great producer.
So, meaning he didn't play an instrument, he wasn't a musician.
No. And, and I remember I interned there for a summer and I got to watch him and I couldn't figure out what makes this guy this great producer. What's he got? And I never figured it out. And then, let's see, that was maybe 74 or 73. And then when I moved to Chicago by '76, after the Playboy gig ended, not only was I working with Steve Goodman, I got hired by another sort of folky singer songwriter named Bonnie Kolak, who was very big in the Midwest. And she got a deal with Epic Records. So we went to New York to make a record and the producer was Joel Dorn. So it was like old home week. But that experience, I learned what made him so great, being a musician for him rather than just watching, you know. And his talent was, first of all, he had a great ear to pick material, and he had a way to make musicians feel comfortable and want to give him their best. And that's a talent,
Mm-hmm.
and that's attitude. And when I tell these kids now, I say the most important thing is your attitude because you can't make good music if there's tension or if you're people are arguing or whatever it is. You gotta it's you're never going to make good music that way. It's not going to happen. So your attitude is the number one thing, and then you got to trust your instincts, and that just comes over time. But I had pretty good instincts from the start, but they've gotten better.
Can you give me an example of instinct? Like what would be an example you having good instinct
Well, for
in
instance, let's take the Mavis record. And I do
okay.
this with every artist and every record. But so when it came time to do vocals with Mavis, Mavis is an amazing singer. She's one of the greatest in the world. You know.
Hmm.
So I would do 3 or 4 takes, maybe 5 sometimes of each song, and I always do full takes. I don't punch in or any of that, unless sometimes you have to, if they can never get one line right or whatever, but rarely. So then I'll take these takes, and I used to do that before Pro Tools. I have the 4 or 5 takes on the console, and I'd go through with the mute buttons, and I'd pick the best line. Let's say there's a verse, and I hear 4 versions of this line, just one line in the verse, and I pick the best one. Then I go to the next line, pick the best one, and that's instinct, knowing what's. And it was so hard with her because everything was great. So what's the best? So
Is it great and different or great and consistent?
it was great and different quite a bit, but it was the one that felt the best, that flowed the best with either that particular line or felt good with the line before it or after it. You know what I mean? And sometimes I go back and change things because of that, whatever line came next or whatever. But that's instinct, and then knowing what to do to a track. What does this track need? And my way of doing that is I never think about arranging a track until I'm doing it. I don't do any pre-production unless I have to write strings or horns or something like that. But these days, that just doesn't happen anymore. Very rarely you have to do that. But when I was doing jingles, I had to do that a lot. But I don't think about the track until I'm sitting down working. And if you know how to listen, the track will tell you what it needs. You just have to be open. It'll tell you what's needed here. You know,
But what it will tell you would be different than what would it tell
of
me.
course, of course. So
It's,
that's where instinct comes in. Here's what I also tell the kids about this similar thing. So I say, look, you can have a band come into my studio 5 days in a row, recording the same song the same way, but a different engineer each day, and that track would sound different. There'd be 5 different sounding tracks because of the engineer or the producer. But I'm a producer slash engineer. I also tell them the pecking order of importance. Number one is the musician. Number two is their instrument, whatever they're playing. Number three is the microphone. Number four is the preamp you use. Then number five is the engineer. So we're like the last on the list, you know. But if you want to get a great sound and a great performance, first of all, the musician's got to be great. Then whatever instrument he has to sound great and be great. Then the microphone, then the preamp, blah blah blah. So, and that's it comes under the instinctual thing too.
I just want to go back a little bit to the years you spent doing commercials.
Okay.
Because once again, that was not in your plan. That's something that you just kind of, an opportunity was presented to you and you rolled with it.
It was
And
not in my plan. No.
yeah, so all of a sudden you say, I don't know if I want to do this. And then you wind up doing a Coke commercial and a McDonald's
Right.
commercial
They were the
immediately.
first
And
two.
then you stick with it for 20
Yeah, yeah.
years. So tell me about how that came about and tell me what that did to you as a producer, as a musician.
Well, it was like the greatest college education and life education that you can get in music. I learned everything doing that because you were on your toes every day. You were put in a pressure situation every single day. You had to think on your feet all the time. But how I got it was I had produced 2 records with a band called Big Twist and the Mellow Fellows. Well, actually, at the time, I had just done 1 record. And the drummer of that band, his brother was a pretty big time jingle guy. He worked for, you ever hear of a guy named Charles Stepney?
No.
He was Quincy Jones's mentor,
Oh.
and he started Earth, Wind, and Fire. Before Earth, Wind, and Fire, he had a band called Rotary Connection. I don't know if you remember that. Minnie Riperton was in that group.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, but he was a music producer in Chicago, Charles Stepney, and he did records, jingles, industrial shows, whatever paid him, he did. So Butch Stewart, who was the guy that I ended up working with, um, became his apprentice, and then Charles died very young. I think he died at 52. He died like 78. So Butch then took over his business. So Butch was doing mainly black market commercials for the African American agencies. He didn't do a lot for general market stuff. So when I did that first Twist album, his brother was the drummer. So he heard the record and really dug it and got my number and called me up and he said, "Hey man, did you ever think about would you ever be interested in writing jingles with me?" And I said, "No, man, I'm not interested in that stuff." And then just so happens that my wife at that time, I had two kids by then, and they were ages 2 and 5. And my wife had left. She left me and the kids. So my attorney, this is 1980 now, my attorney said to me, you're going to have to go to court and prove to the state of Illinois that you can raise your kids and provide for them. Now, if I was a woman, I wouldn't have had to do that. But because I was a man, I had to do it. You don't have to do that now, but in 1980 you did. So when he heard that Butch Stewart called me, he looked at me and said, "Call him right now and take that job because you're going to make a lot of money and that's going to help your case. The judge will grant you custody because you're going to be making a ton of money." And he was right. I think in 1979, I probably didn't even break 20 grand producing like mostly blues records. In 1980, the end of that year, I made $250,000. Pretty big jump.
Okay, so I have to ask, and if you don't want to answer, that's totally fine. But being a young man with two young kids and taking on a new job, which I presume is maybe not all consuming, but it requires a bit of your time in order
It was
for you
all
to
consuming.
succeed. So, how do you raise kids and start a new job and do all
Well,
this?
the way I handled it was my family's all on the East Coast. I had no family here. When my wife left, my mother came out for 2 weeks to help me. Then she had to go home. So there I was by myself with two little kids. So I found daycare for them. And when I first got into the jingle business, I didn't have a lot of money. So a friend of mine, who's an incredible keyboard player, great blues player too. He played with Mayo and a bunch of people, and he's recorded with everybody. But he lent me the money to get my kids into daycare. And then within like 2 or 3 weeks, I paid him back everything because I was making so much money was coming in. And I did that for a while. And then, if the sessions ran late, which happened a lot, I'd have to leave sessions, go get my kids, and bring them back to the studio. And I did that a lot. And they would do their homework in the green room. And sometimes the sessions would go to 11 at night and they'd be asleep and I have to carry them down to the car one at a time, that sort of thing. But thank God, most of my clients understood my situation. So if I had to leave for 30 minutes to go get my children, they said, "Cool, we'll take a little break and when you come back, we'll continue." So that's how I did it. For 1 year, I hired a nanny, and that was it. I only had her for 1 year, and she only picked them up from daycare. And when I got home, she left. She didn't stay with us. Then after that, it was just all me.
What made you a good jingles writer?
Instinct. I was just really good at it, man. I don't know why. I think Copeland had something to do with it, with understanding how to write a melody. Um, but I would be able to do it so fast. Like I'd be driving in the car going downtown to the studio, and sometimes we'd have maybe two to write that day, sometimes even three. And I'd have the script, and I would read it into a recorder as I was driving, and then I'd write the melody. I'd read the lyrics, and I'd write the melody, and I have it done before I even got to the studio. And the guys I was working with, they used to get so pissed off. They said, "Man, give us a chance. You got the thing written. We haven't even opened the case yet." You know, I was really fast at doing it. You know,
And
at
what's the
writing.
secret to that?
There is no, I don't know. There's no secret to that. You know, we wrote a lot of famous jingles. You know, Butch Butch had written Coke adds life to everybody. Want you living life, Coca Cola. And then we did Have You Driven a Ford lately? And we did Everything Else Is Just a Light, Bud Light, everything else. And we did Domino's Pizza Delivers. I mean, we did so many of them, man. I can't
Okay,
even,
so you do this for 20
yeah.
years. Were you doing anything else, or
Oh,
was
yeah.
this
I
basically
was making records
okay?
those 20 years.
Okay, so it wasn't like all the time, twenty four
Well, it
seven.
was, but
Yeah.
the free time I had, I would maybe try to get in at night or on weekends, and I'd have to find babysitters for my kids. It was really difficult, but I did it. I managed to do it. I did a Richie Havens album in that time. I made a number of records during that period. Um, I finished two Steve Goodman albums during that period. I did a record with David Bromberg during that period. Um, and there's more. I can't even think. But I made two records. No, one record with John Martin, and then later I made more records with him after that period. But I'm looking up at the wall here because all my records are up here. Anyway, I made the Big Twist stuff. The second Big Twist record was done while I was doing jingles.
But by this time, you're basically a producer. You're not pursuing being a musician.
No, I was done playing gigs. You know, I didn't want to. I didn't want to really play gigs. I mean, I did a few now and again. You know, if someone that I really liked, like in '77. Well, this is no, that's before that. In '77, I toured with Leonard Cohen because one of my close friends was his bass player and he got sick. His name is Steve Berg, and he called me up and said, "Man, can you do like 3 weeks with Leonard?" And I said, "Yeah." So I went out with him. But so after that, I probably did some gigs. I might have did a couple gigs with Steve Goodman. I did a few with Bonnie Kolak. Tom Bishop is another songwriter. I did some gigs during that jingle period, but not many. I just wanted to produce music.
Okay, so I think I read somewhere that when you were very young, you went to see people like Todd Rundgren,
Yep,
and I think Levon Helm was one of
yep,
them that
yep,
you had seen who had a major impact on you. And many years later, you got a chance to produce his
yeah.
album.
Well, I produced some tracks with Levon, yeah. And Danko. Danko and I became really close, Rick Danko. Danko and I wrote 26 songs together. Um, yeah, Rudgren in Atlantic City, um, summertime was it in Atlantic City. It was like one of the greatest places to be. Lots of music. So Rudgren had a band. Rudgren was only like a year or two older than me. He might be 2 years old. But he had a band called Woody's Truck Stop. And they were playing the bars on the shore, you know. And I used to see his band, you know. And then Levon is, probably 10 years older than me. But they had a band called Levon and the Hawks. And they used to play a place called Tony Mart's in Summers Point, New Jersey, which is just really close to Atlantic City. And they used to do Sunday matinees, which the bands hated. But Tony Mart's made all the bands do a matinee. So my father would always bring my brother and I to the matinees to see the bands. And that's when I first saw Levon and the Hawks. And that's when I first saw Todd Rundgren's band. And Todd Rundgren, I think, was underage when I first saw him. He was probably 16, maybe 17. He wasn't legally playing in the bar, but he was so good, you know. And then I met Todd in the later years. I never worked with Todd, but I did get to work with Levon and Danko and Garth. Never worked with Richard Manuel. I met those guys in the early '80s because this band Big Twist and the Mellow Fellows, that was the band's favorite band.
Wow.
So when they would come to Chicago or anywhere in the Midwest where Big Twist was playing, they'd show up at the gig because they loved that band. And that's when I first met them. But I didn't do any work with them until the late '80s, maybe even the early '90s. But yeah,
So we'll skip ahead to 2003, 2004, and one of the reasons why I contacted you was because of the Mavis Staples album. Tell me the story behind that album and how it came to be.
okay. So 9/11, when the planes hit the towers, we were all fucking devastated, right? Everyone was like, whoa. So the next day, the next morning on the 12th, my sister calls me and she said, they call me Jimmy. My family and close childhood friends call me Jimmy. So she said, Jimmy, did you hear about John O'Neill? I said, no. He said, well, he died yesterday in the towers. And I said, what was he doing there? John O'Neill worked for the FBI for 35 years, and he was tracking terrorists. He was tracking Osama bin Laden in the '80s. And I didn't know this, but he quit in July of 2001, the FBI. And he got the job as head of security at the World Trade Center. And he started on Monday, the 10th. And he died on Tuesday, the 11th. So that was like, oh my God, that just, I went to high school with him. And my sister used to date him. So we all knew each other really well. 2 hours later, my brother calls me. And he said, did you hear about Victor? I said, no. I said, Victor Saraceni? He goes, yeah. Victor was one of the pilots on one of the United Airlines flights that went into the building. And he had his throat slashed before they went into the building. So here I am sitting in Chicago, and I knew these two people very well that got killed. So it sort of inspired me. It did inspire me to start writing this song. And I'm not one to jump on bandwagons with tragedies. I mean, that's not me. But because it was so personal to me and I was so affected, I started writing this song. And it was in times like these. So Levon Helm calls me like that afternoon, and I had pretty much finished the song. I think I was missing the last verse. And he said, my nickname is Tools. And he said, Tools, what do you think of all this? And I said, Lee, I can't believe it. What do you say? We were all like dumbfounded. And I told him what I just told you about my two friends. And I said, it inspired me to write a song. And I sang it for him. He said, play it for me. So I sang it for him over the phone. As soon as I was finished, he said, Mavis Staples should sing that song. So next thing I know, he had called Mavis, which I didn't know. And Mavis called me like an hour later and said, Levon says you got a song I need to record. And she said, do you have a fax machine? I said, yeah. She said, can you fax me the lyrics? So I did. And I was still missing the last verse, but I faxed her the first three verses in the chorus. And she called me right away, like 10 minutes later, and said, I'll sing it. And I said, Mavis, you haven't heard it. You want me to play it for you? She goes, you don't have to. Levon said it was great. So that was it. So 4 days later, maybe 3 days, the 16th. So I guess it was 4 days later. We were uh, we were in the studio recording, and she learned the song, the melody, 5 minutes before she recorded it. She didn't know. Well, she sang in the chorus, so I did all the choruses first. So she had heard all that, and then we went downstairs to a different studio to do the lead vocal. So after we did that, she sounded incredible, and she loved the song.
Had you worked with her before?
No, but I had met her through the band, but I hadn't worked with her. And I met her briefly. It wasn't like we were pals or anything. In fact, when we ended up working together, she didn't even remember meeting me. I said, Mavis, I met you like 10 or 15 years ago. She didn't remember. So anyway, after we finished that song, She calls me up a couple days later and she said, "You know, we started, the Staple Singers have a record that's not finished because Pops had just died a few months before that." She said, "Would you help me finish the record?" And I said, "Absolutely, I'd love to." So she got me all the masters. They were all on, most of them, some of them were on tape and some of them were on ADAT. So I got all the masters and I had it all transferred to Pro Tools. And I started working on it. And during that process, I said, "May, you should do a solo record." She said, "No, I'm done." She said, "I don't want to go out and tour without my dad." She said, "I'm done."
Just as a reference, the album before that she did was with
She did
Prince.
two with Prince. Yeah.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, they didn't seem to do as well as maybe it
Well,
should
the
have.
reason why is because Prince was boycotting the label. He had changed his name to the artist formerly known as, because
Right.
he was trying to get off Warner Brothers because
Right.
he didn't like the deal. So they weren't going to promote it, and they weren't going to promote any record he was involved with, including Mavis. So they didn't promote those records, you know. But anyway, so I convinced her to do a solo album. I convinced her to do it.
And thank God you did.
Yeah. And she, even to this day, when she does interviews, she'll even say Tullio was the guy who got my career a second life. Because if he didn't convince me to do that record, I probably wouldn't be singing now. So
Well, it's amazing how well she has done since that that album that you did with
yeah,
her. Has continued to do well, and he's still at her age still touring like crazy,
crazy. I know.
and producing albums, every couple of years or whatever. But that album, which is "Have a Little Faith," is my favorite Mavis
Me
album.
too.
Did you know that it was special when you recorded it?
Yes. And what's weird is when we finished that record, I'm going to tell you a story that I'm not even sure I want people to know, but fuck it. She had just gotten this manager, David. I can't remember his last name. He still manages. And when we finished Have a Little Faith, they had hooked up. So Mavis calls me up and she said, "Tools, call. Here's his number. Give him a call and introduce yourself because you're my producer. He's my manager." So I call him and go, "David, this is Jim Tullio. I produced Have a Little Faith." And his response was, "And?" That was his response. I said, "Oh, really?" And I hung up. He was like
Hmm.
24 years old or something. This little punk, you know. And so his goal, and he did it. And I guess it's good for me. His goal was to get Mavis out of the traditional sense and put her in with this new crop of artists and try to get a new audience. And that's how she got Tweety and all that. And now she's playing all the young people know who Mavis is. And that was his
Hmm.
doing, you know. And the Tweety records, I'm not a Wilco fan at all. I don't think they're very good, in my opinion, but that's my. And those records, there's a couple good songs, but to me, they're Jeff Tweedy records. They're not Mavis Staples records.
Right.
I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah.
They don't sound like Mavis records to me. But yeah, so Have a Little Faith. It was a very special thing, man. And when she sang, Mako, I mean, I would sit there with the headphones on. And we recorded most of that record in my basement, and she was standing right next to me singing. I had really good equipment, and I would do the drums in a big studio and all that, and then I'd bring it home and do all the overdubs in my basement. But I would sit there and I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Like I had to touch myself. Is this really happening? Because it was so good. Like the track "God Is Not Sleeping."
Hmm.
Oh my God! I mean, I was, the hairs they're standing up right now on my arms just thinking about it. I mean, it was so powerful. It's like, whoa. And she's right there. And that's how good she was. And I had worked with Aretha before that. And Aretha is unbelievable. Don't get me wrong. She is. But no one made me feel like Mavis. No one gave me that feeling. No other singer since has given me that feeling from Mavis Staples. Like, wow,
Wow.
this is like an anointed moment. You know,
What does that record mean to you?
it means a lot. I mean, it's a great record. And I think it's one of her biggest selling solo albums. You know, I know it's a lot of people's favorite from her solo work.
Hmm.
Um, right after we finished this record, she did this national interview on NPR, and one of the questions was, they said to her, "If you can work with anybody, alive or dead, who would it be? Like as a producer?" And she said Tullio, which just was like, "Oh my god!" You know,
I have to ask, does it bother you that you haven't worked with her again?
I mean a little bit, but not. I'm over it. Because I had written a lot of songs for the next album, and she had asked me to do another record, and I wrote a bunch of songs for that record, and then he hooked her up with Ry Cooder, and when he did, Mavis called me, and she was a little bit embarrassed, and I said, "Mavis, Ry Cooder's fabulous, so don't worry, I'm not offended at all." And she did all these old sort of protest songs with him. So I thought the next record we do a record, and that's when he put her in touch with Jeff Tweedy.
Right.
But the songs I had written for her, I ended up doing two records with the Blind Boys of Alabama, and well, actually, that's another long story. It was Clarence Fountain and Sam Butler. Clarence Fountain was the original originator of the Blind Boys,
Right.
and it's another long story, but it was for them. And the songs I had written for Mavis, they recorded because they had heard the Mavis record and called me up and said, "Hey, we want you to produce us."
Um, you have a studio called Butcher Boy Studios,
Yeah.
and you work with young kids. Tell me a little bit about the concept behind this.
Well, that's the main thing. That's not all I do, but it's the main thing I do now. I started this program a month before the pandemic hit. And the reason why I started, because look, I'm getting older, and the work, I was still getting work, but not as much as I used to get. I used to get a lot of work. I was always making a record. But, it's just, hip hop and everyone's a producer kind of thing, So I was getting less and less work, and I thought, I think I want to give back. I had a really great career, and I've made enough money, and I want to help these kids. And so I started this program, and we did it all through the pandemic because I only have one or two kids at a time. It's not like I have a class of kids. And we do tracks from start to finish, like world class tracks with songs that they write or a cover. Sometimes it's a cover, but it's just been fabulous. And we've now done about 163, I think, tracks in 4 years, which is a lot of tracks.
Can you just kind of summarize what the intent of this program was and what you hope to achieve?
Just to help the kids learn how to make their own music, produce their own music, because that's the trend now. Everyone's recording it in their bedroom, but I'm trying to show them. I mean, I wish you could see my stuff. I have all analog gear, really old. Here, let's see. I might be able to show you.
I see a huge soundboard there.
Well, that's an SSL. But if you can see all that stuff,
Yeah.
these are old Ampex amplifiers from the 50s, early 50s, and then all the old compressors. And so I have all analog stuff. And I use Pro Tools. I had Pro Tools in 91. I was one of the first like 10 people in the world to own Pro Tools. And I got it because um, I knew it was inferior sonically. It's not as good as analog. Digital sucks compared to analog. But I knew that the creative possibilities that you can do with it outweighed the sonic deficiencies. And I also knew that if you had all the right equipment, you can get that sound back, that spatial sound. And the way I describe it to my kids when they first come, I say, take a white piece of paper and take a ballpoint pen and make a dot. That's digital. That dot's never going to change. But if you take a Sharpie and make a dot, the ink spreads. That's analog. Analog gives you space and bigness. Digital doesn't do that. Digital doesn't give you anything. And that space and bigness comes from harmonic distortion. And that's what happens when audio hits tape. It gives you that Sharpie effect. And I also learned in the 90s when I stopped using tape. You know what a transformer is
Hmm.
in electronics? When audio hits a transformer, the same principle happens as when audio hits tape. So my console, I used to have a Neve, and that had every input had a transformer and every output had a transformer. Now I have an SSL and every input has a transformer. So you can get close to sound of tape using Pro Tools if you have the right equipment. And that's what I teach these kids because these kids come in, they never saw any of this stuff. You know, I have these LA2As from the early '60s, and they go, "Oh, I have that plug-in." And I say to them, "When you were a kid, did you play with Matchbox cars?" They go, "Yeah." Well, your plug-in's a Matchbox car. This is a real car. That's the difference between a plug-in and the real thing, and that's true. That's how different it is. You know,
What does this doing this for the kids give you?
I mean, most of these kids are fantastic, Maka. They're fantastic, and my reasoning for that is they grew up with YouTube since birth. They've had access to YouTube, so they can watch their heroes. They can watch a guy produce a track. They can watch Herbie Hancock play the piano, and a lot of times their heroes will give them tutorials and show them exactly what they do. Their guitar plays, whatever it is. So they're so much more advanced than we were. I mean, I had to listen to a record and slow it down to 16 to get the guitar parts, you know. So they're amazing. These kids. I'll send you some of the. Well, did you go onto the website? What's your
Yes, I
blog?
did.
Okay, then you can hear some tracks there under projects, and they're great. If you go and really go back and listen, these kids are really great. And I'm doing really world class work with these kids. Two of them have gotten record deals now through our program.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's working.
My final question, and thank you so much for doing this at
Of
short
course,
notice.
of course.
Tell me what that young kid who listened to Revolver and said, "That's what I want to do." When you think about that kid and all you've had to experience being in the studio, tell me, can you summarize that journey?
I mean, I'm still trying to do that. I'm still trying to get to that point. I mean, what did Shakespeare? One of the greatest quotes of all time is Shakespeare said, "A satisfied artist is no longer an artist." Right.
Right.
So you're constantly reaching and trying to find new things and new ways and how to get there. And what's so great about music and production, every song is different. So there's no A, B, C, D, and you get to E. There's no formula because every song's different. So it's a challenge every day.
Right.
It's always a challenge. And that's where instinct comes in. You know, instinct and attitude comes in. You got to have the right instinct, man, to do this. And I guess you can develop it, but you sort of have to have that. It has to be sort of in you. You have to have the desire, you know. And I've always had the desire.
Did you never lose that?
I never lost it. And every day I come down here, it's always like a mystery, and it's still a thrill for me. Like when I get up in the morning and I'm working on a track, I go, yeah, I got that track. Can't wait to get down there to start on that.
What a gift, eh?
Yeah, it is. It really is. And I told you earlier, I think it's a metaphysical thing. And I'm not religious. Don't get me wrong. I'm not this, but I think it's a metaphysical sort of thing that happens. Who knows? Who knows where it comes from? I don't
Well,
know.
thank you for your great work. As I said, I love that album. I still listen to it. I think the John Prine live, I also love, and I think you worked on that as well.
Mix some stuff on that here.
Jim, it was a real pleasure meeting you. Thank you so much for
You
doing
too,
this.
man. You too. And
Thank,
good luck with your show.
thank you.